All right, strap in, everyone, because today we are going deep on executive power. We're cracking open Chapter 2 of Mandate for Leadership, The Conservative Promise. This book, it's basically a playbook for a hypothetical conservative president, right, taking office in 2025. And let me tell you, it's got some pretty strong opinions about how to reshape the federal bureaucracy.
It definitely doesn't pull any punches.
Yeah.
It lays out this really bold vision. And it starts with a pretty provocative premise. Basically, the idea is that the executive branch has gotten way too big, too powerful. It's acting independently, not really following the president's agenda.
Okay, so they're setting up a problem here, and it sounds like they're not afraid to use some loaded language to make their point. I mean, the chapter throws around terms like radical and woke pretty liberally. They're framing this whole bureaucratic expansion as a direct threat to, well, to the American people.
Right. They're definitely trying to sound the alarm. But here's where it gets interesting. They try to tie this argument back to the Founding Fathers. They even quote Madison, from Federalist 47, talking about the dangers of concentrated power.
So they're invoking the Constitution to justify shrinking the government. That's a bit ironic, isn't it?
It is, but it shows you how they're trying to frame this. They're not just saying, we want smaller government. They're saying, this is what the founders intended. It's a way of legitimizing their
Wow.
agenda.
Okay, I get the strategy. So they've laid out the problem, at least from their perspective. How do they propose to fix it?
Well, that's where the Executive Office of the President comes in, the EOP.
Sure, the EOP. It's basically all the president's advisors, right? The folks who help him run the show.
Yeah, but the chapter sees it as way more than that. They describe it as the president's toolkit. Not just advisors, but the actual tools he needs to control the entire federal bureaucracy.
So the EOP is the toolkit. What's the main tool they focus on?
Well, it's the one you'd probably expect. The Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, as everyone calls it.
Right, the OMB, the budget folks. What's so special about them?
They describe it as the air traffic control of the entire executive branch, which I thought was a pretty interesting analogy. They're the ones who make sure everything's running smoothly, everything's aligned with the president's agenda. And we're not just talking about budget stuff here. We're talking agency performance, IT oversight, even setting the regulatory agenda for the whole government.
Whoa, hold on. That sounds like a lot of power for one office. How much influence can they actually wield? Especially over agencies that are supposed to be independent.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because on paper, some agencies have a lot of autonomy. But the chapter digs into some pretty obscure stuff, tools that most people don't even know about, like the apportionment process.
Yeah.
Basically, OMB can control how agencies spend their money, even after Congress has already allocated the funds.
Wait, so even if Congress passes a law saying spend this money on X, the OMB can come in and say, nope, you're spending it on Y.
In theory, yes. They can say, okay, you got this much money, but you can only spend it on these specific things. It's a way of enforcing the president's priorities, even if Congress doesn't agree with them.
Wow, that's pretty sneaky.
Well, it's all about finding those levers of power, right?
Yeah.
And they're very upfront about wanting to maximize the president's control. They even point to the Trump administration as an example, saying they did a good job of using these tactics.
So they're basically saying, here's how to get your way, even if everyone else is trying to stop you.
Yeah, it's pretty bold. They also emphasize the importance of having a strong general counsel within OMB, someone who's willing to, push the boundaries, challenge legal precedents, find creative ways to assert executive power.
It sounds like they're not afraid of a little legal wrangling. They're looking for loopholes, ways to bend the rules without breaking them.
Exactly. They're not just playing by the book. They're writing their own playbook.
Okay, so we've got this powerful OMB, strategically using its influence over the entire bureaucracy. But what about the budget itself? How does that fit into this power play? I mean, they call it taming the $31 trillion beast for a reason, right?
Yeah, they really hammer home the point that the U.S. fiscal situation is a huge problem. And they see the president's budget as the solution, or at least the starting point. It's not just about numbers. It's about using the budget to enforce discipline, to dictate what agencies can and cannot do.
So it's not just cutting spending. It's about strategically allocating resources to achieve specific goals.
Exactly. They even recommend something called administrative PA-go, which means any new spending has to be offset by cuts elsewhere. No more just adding stuff to the budget willy-nilly.
That sounds like a recipe for some tough choices.
Oh, absolutely. It would create a lot of competition for resources. Agencies would have to really justify every dollar they spend.
Okay, so they've got the budget as a weapon, and OMB is the one wielding it. What else is in this executive toolkit?
Well, there's another side to OMB that they focus on, the M side. which stands for management. It covers things like procurement, personnel, IT, even the Made in America agenda.
That sounds kind of boring compared to, high-level policy stuff.
It might seem that way, but the chapter argues that these functions are actually incredibly powerful. For example, by shifting procurement policies, you can favor certain businesses or industries.
So even the seemingly mundane aspects of government can be used to achieve political goals.
Absolutely. It's all about understanding the levers of power. And they're very explicit about wanting to empower political appointees to run these offices. They even say to resist the influence of the good government types.
Interesting. So they're not just trying to control the top levels of government. They're trying to inject their ideology into every nook and cranny of the bureaucracy.
That's one way to put it. They want to make sure their vision is being implemented at every level.
Okay, I think we're starting to get a sense of how they view executive power. It's about control. It's about strategy. It's about using every tool at your disposal to achieve your goals.
That's a pretty good summary. And we've only just scratched the surface. There's a whole lot more to unpack here, a lot more tools in that toolkit.
Well, I'm definitely intrigued, if a little bit terrified. Let's take a break here, and when we come back, we'll delve into some of the specific policies they're trying to enact using these tools.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so we've established that they want a strong, assertive executive branch. But what are they actually trying to do with all that power? What policies are they looking to implement?
Well, they cover a lot of ground in this chapter, but a big focus is on what they call reining in the federal government. They see it as having too much power, too much reach. So a lot of their proposals are about shrinking its role, especially in the economy.
Makes sense, coming from a conservative perspective. So where do they start?
One area they spend a lot of time on is regulatory reform. They want to streamline the whole process, make it easier for businesses to operate. For example, they talk about simplifying permitting for infrastructure projects. Things like pipelines, highways, that kind of stuff.
So less red tape, faster approvals. Sounds like they're trying to make it easier to build things.
Exactly. They also want to limit the use of environmental impact assessments. They argue these assessments often get bogged down in litigation, delaying projects for years.
Okay, so they're trying to speed things up, reduce the risk of lawsuits, but wouldn't that also make it harder to protect the environment?
That's the trade-off, right? They argue that excessive regulation stifles economic growth, that it creates uncertainty for businesses, discourages investment.
So their argument is that by reducing regulation, you actually help the environment in the long run.
Well, they wouldn't say it quite like that. Their focus is on unleashing the power of the free market. They believe that businesses, left to their own devices, will innovate and find solutions to environmental problems.
Okay, so it's a bit of a trickle-down theory applied to the environment.
You could say that.
But they don't stop at just tweaking regulations. They also call for a complete overhaul of energy and environmental policy.
Right, this is where things get really controversial. They specifically target policies aimed at addressing climate change.
Like the Paris Climate Accord, renewable energy subsidies, that kind of thing.
Exactly. They argue these policies are based on flawed science, that they're too costly, that they hurt the economy without actually addressing the problem.
So they're basically climate change skeptics.
Well, they wouldn't necessarily use that term, but they definitely downplay the urgency of the issue. They advocate for a shift away from renewable energy sources. They want to focus on more traditional sources like fossil fuels.
Wow, that's a pretty stark contrast to the direction most of the world is moving in.
It is. It's a pretty big gamble, and one that's sure to generate a lot of debate.
So they're basically saying, let's double down on fossil fuels, even if it means potentially making climate change worse.
It's a pretty bold stance, and one that's sure to be unpopular with a lot of people.
Okay, so we've got deregulation, we've got a shift away from climate action. What else is on their agenda?
Well, their approach to foreign policy is also pretty interesting. They advocate for a much more assertive, you could even say nationalistic approach.
America first, basically.
Exactly. They're skeptical of multilateralism, of institutions like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization.
So they want to go it alone, ditch the allies.
Not necessarily ditch them, but they're definitely more focused on pursuing American interests, even if it means ruffling some feathers.
It sounds like they're advocating for a pretty big shift in how America interacts with the rest of the world.
It is. They see the world as a very competitive place,
Hmm.
and they believe America needs to be strong to protect its interests.
Okay, so we've got a more assertive foreign policy, a focus on deregulation, a skeptical view of climate change. What about the economy? What's their approach there?
Well, as you might expect, they're big proponents of lower taxes. They argue that high taxes stifle economic growth, discourage investment.
So the classic supply-side argument, cut taxes and the economy will boom.
Exactly. They also want to reduce government spending. They see the federal government as too big, too wasteful.
Okay, so lower taxes, smaller government, sounds like a pretty standard conservative platform.
It is. But they don't just focus on the broad strokes. They also get into some pretty specific policy areas.
Like what?
Well, for example, they want to reform entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare.
Ooh, that's a tough one. Those programs are incredibly popular, but they're also facing some serious financial challenges.
Right, and they acknowledge that reform is needed, but they don't really get into specifics about what those reforms would look like.
So they're punting on the details.
A little bit, yeah. It's a politically sensitive issue, and they're probably trying to avoid alienating voters.
Smart strategy, but it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Energy, environment, foreign policy, economics, even entitlement reform. It's a pretty sweeping agenda, and I'm sure it would be met with a lot of resistance.
Oh, absolutely. These are all complex issues, and their proposals are very much in line with a particular conservative ideology.
Right. It's important to remember that this is just one perspective. We're diving deep into their vision, but it's not the only way to approach these issues.
Exactly. And it's important to consider the potential downsides of their approach. For example, their focus on deregulation could lead to weaker protections for the environment and consumers.
And their America First foreign policy could alienate allies and make the world a more dangerous place.
Right. There are always trade-offs. And it's important to weigh the potential costs and benefits of any policy proposal.
Okay, so we've gotten a good sense of the what of their agenda. But I'm also curious about the how. How do they actually envision putting all of this into action? What role do they see for Congress, the courts, and the American people?
Those are all great questions, and ones that we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, folks, stay tuned. We're about to get into the really juicy stuff, the nitty-gritty of how they plan to reshape American government. Okay, so we spent a lot of time in the weeds, really digging into their vision for a strong executive branch, all those tools, all those policies. But I guess, what happens next? What happens when they try to put it all into practice?
Well, that's the big question, right? And it's not one with any easy answers. But I think the most immediate concern is how this vision would impact the balance of power, within the government itself.
Right, because we have this whole system of checks and balances. Each branch is supposed to kind of keep the others in check. But this chapter seems to be arguing for a much, more dominant executive.
Yeah, they definitely want to shift that balance. Their argument is that the executive branch has been weakened over time, that Congress and the courts have become too assertive.
Okay, so they see it as a course correction, restoring the executive to its rightful place, so to speak.
Right, but their critics would say it's a power grab. They'd use terms like imperial presidency and all that.
Whoa. That's a pretty serious charge.
It is, and it gets to the heart of what's really at stake here. I mean, this vision has big implications for how our government works.
Okay, so let's break it down. They're saying a strong president, unhindered by the bureaucracy, can deliver on promises, be more accountable to the people. But what about Congress? They're supposed to be a co-equal branch of government. How would they react to this whole power shift?
I doubt they'd be happy about it. The chapter acknowledges that some of their proposals would require, congressional approval, but they also suggest that a really savvy president could find ways around that.
Like what? How do you just bypass Congress?
Well, they talk about using executive orders,
Yeah.
Directives from the president that have the force of law. They also mention agency rulemaking. That's where the executive branch makes its own rules and regulations without going through Congress.
So they're basically advocating for governing by decree.
It's definitely a more assertive approach.
But wouldn't that lead to legal challenges? I mean, people would sue, right?
Most certainly. And that's where the courts come in. They become the referees in this whole power struggle.
So the fate of this whole vision, this whole agenda, could hinge on the judiciary.
Potentially, yeah. Especially the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Right now, the court's pretty evenly divided ideologically, so the outcome of any legal battle would depend a lot on which justices are hearing the case.
It's a reminder that elections really do matter, not just for who's president, but for who gets appointed to the courts.
Right, because those appointments can have long-lasting consequences.
Okay, so we've got this three-way power struggle: executive, legislative, judicial, all vying for control.
Yeah, it's a constant push and pull.
But beyond all the legal and political wrangling, there's a bigger question here. What does this all mean for American democracy itself?
Right, because democracy relies on this balance of power, on different voices being heard, different perspectives. But this chapter seems to advocate for a much more top-down approach,
Hmm.
where the president's vision is the one that dominates.
So are they saying, trust the president? He knows best.
It's kind of like that, yeah. They argue that a strong leader is necessary to get things done, to cut through the gridlock, to implement the will of the people.
But critics would say that's too much power for one person, that it undermines those checks and balances we were talking about.
Exactly. It's a classic debate, right? How much power should any one person have in a democracy?
Tough question. So what's the answer? Where do you land on this whole thing?
Honestly, I don't know. It's something we all have to wrestle with as citizens, because it's our democracy that's at stake.
Well said. So folks, we've reached the end of our deep dive. We've explored a lot of ideas, a lot of potential consequences, but I think this is just the beginning of the conversation.
I agree. This chapter is a challenge, a provocation. It's asking us to think critically about how our government works and to decide what kind of future we want for our country.
So, dear listener, we leave you with this final thought. This chapter offers a vision of a powerful presidency, a president who can enact bold change, who can reshape the political landscape. But at what cost? Would such a transformation ultimately strengthen or weaken our democracy?
That's the question we all need to ask ourselves.
Yeah.
Because the choices we make today will determine the kind of country we become tomorrow.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a wild ride, and we'll see you next time for another exploration of the ideas that are shaping our world.
See you then.